On a quiet evening in Carmel by the Sea, California, outside a small independent theater where classic films still flicker across worn screens, a figure sat motionless against the brick wall. His weathered hands clutched a cardboard sign, the words barely visible in the fading light. The jacket he wore, though faded and frayed at the edges, still bore the unmistakable markings of military service. Patches that once represented pride, duty, and sacrifice now told a different story, one of a system that had somehow failed to catch him when he fell. Passers-by moved quickly, their eyes deliberately avoiding his gaze, each lost in their own worlds, their own concerns. It's a scene that plays out thousands of times across America every single day. In every city, outside theaters and restaurants and places where people gather to escape reality for a while. But on this particular evening, something extraordinary was about to unfold, something that would reveal the true character of one of Hollywood's most legendary figures in a way no scripted scene ever could. Clint Eastwood needs no introduction to most Americans. For over 6 decades, he has embodied a particular brand of American masculinity, the strong, silent type who lets actions speak louder than words. From his early days as Rowdy Yates on Rawhide to his iconic portrayal of the man with no name in Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns, Eastwood carved out a unique place in cinema history. His squinting eyes and measured drawl became instantly recognizable worldwide. As Dirty Harry Callahan, he delivered lines that entered the American lexicon. As director and producer, he crafted films that explored honor, duty, justice, and the complex nature of heroism. Films like Unforgiven, $1 Million Baby, Gran Torino, and American Sniper demonstrated not just technical mastery, but a deep understanding of human struggle and redemption. Throughout his career, Eastwood has maintained an almost mythical privacy, rarely engaging in the typical celebrity circus, avoiding scandal, and conducting himself with old-school professionalism that seems increasingly rare in modern Hollywood. What many people might not fully appreciate is Eastwood's consistent respect for military service and veterans. This wasn't just Hollywood posturing or convenient patriotism for box office appeal. Those who've worked with him describe a genuine reverence for those who've served. When he directed American Sniper, the story of Navy SEAL Chris Kyle, Eastwood approached the material with profound respect, consulting extensively with veterans and Kyle's family to ensure authenticity. When he made Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, he told both sides of that brutal battle with equal humanity, refusing to reduce complex human experiences to simplistic propaganda. His portrayal of Gunnery Sergeant Tom Highway in Heartbreak Ridge showed not just the tough exterior of a career Marine, but the deep bonds and unspoken codes that define military service. These weren't just roles or projects to Eastwood. They represented something fundamental about duty, sacrifice, and the debt owed to those who sign a blank check payable with their lives if necessary. Yet despite this public track record, despite decades of demonstrating these values through his work, what happened that evening outside the theater in Carmel still managed to shock those closest to him. His bodyguards, professionals trained to anticipate threats and manage public interactions efficiently, thought they knew how their client operated. They'd seen him navigate countless public situations with his trademark stoic efficiency, polite but brief, accommodating but boundaried, never rude but rarely lingering. They developed protocols for managing encounters, for keeping things moving, for protecting both his time and his privacy. They thought they'd seen every version of Clint Eastwood's public persona. They were wrong. To understand the significance of what transpired, we need to confront an uncomfortable truth about America's treatment of its veterans. On any given night in the United States, approximately 40,000 veterans experience homelessness. Read that number again. 40,000 men and women who raised their right hands, swore an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies foreign and domestic, who trained for war, who deployed to distant lands, who witnessed and experienced things most civilians can never fully comprehend, now sleep on streets, in shelters, in vehicles, or in places not meant for human habitation. These aren't abstract statistics. Each number represents a human being with a story, with family, with service records documenting their contributions. They are combat veterans from Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. They are peacetime service members, who maintained readiness during the Cold War. They are men and women from all branches, all eras, all backgrounds, united by service and now united by a struggle that should shame us as a nation. The causes of veteran homelessness are complex and interconnected. Post-traumatic stress disorder leaves many unable to maintain stable employment or relationships. Traumatic brain injuries from explosions and impacts create cognitive challenges that make navigating civilian bureaucracy nearly impossible. Substance abuse, often beginning as self-medication for physical or psychological pain, spirals into addiction. The military-to-civilian transition, which should be carefully managed, instead dumps service members into a world where their skills don't easily translate, where their bearing and directness can seem strange, where the camaraderie and sense of purpose that defined their identity suddenly vanishes. Add to this inadequate VA resources, long wait times for benefits and health care, affordable housing shortages, and a civilian population that thanks them for their service while averting their eyes on the street, and you have a perfect storm of systemic failure. What makes veteran homelessness particularly cruel is the invisibility of it. These individuals become part of the urban landscape that we train ourselves not to see. We walk past, we drive by, we make ourselves busy with our phones. We convince ourselves that someone else will help, that there are programs and services, that surely someone who served their country won't be allowed to simply fall through the cracks. But they do fall through those cracks every single day, and our collective ability to not see them becomes a kind of silent complicity. The cardboard signs blend together. The faces become interchangeable. The humanity gets lost in our discomfort and hurry, and the overwhelming sense that the problem is too big for any individual response to matter. This was the situation outside that theater in Carmel. The veterans sitting against the wall had become functionally invisible. Theater-goers stepped around him, some with momentary flickers of sympathy, others with practiced indifference, most with that peculiar combination of both. The evening crowd was gathering for a screening, the small-town atmosphere lending a genteel quality to the scene that somehow made the veteran's presence even more jarring. And then Clint Eastwood arrived. His vehicle pulled up to the curb, and his security team moved into their practiced routine. The goal was always smooth. Efficient transit from vehicle to venue with minimal disruption or exposure. They'd performed this dance hundreds of times in hundreds of locations. One bodyguard moved ahead to ensure the entrance was clear. Another positioned himself to manage any approaching fans or onlookers. Eastwood emerged from the vehicle, and for a moment the scene unfolded exactly as expected. He nodded to someone who greeted him, his iconic profile unmistakable even in the dimming light. The bodyguards began their subtle choreography of movement, creating a clear path forward. Then Eastwood stopped. He'd seen the veteran. In that moment, everything changed. Instead of the expected smooth entry into the theater, instead of the polite acknowledgement and continued movement that everyone anticipated, Eastwood did something that froze his security team in place. He changed direction and walked directly toward the homeless veteran sitting against the wall. The bodyguards exchanged quick glances, immediately recalibrating. This wasn't the protocol. This wasn't the plan. Their job was to minimize unpredictable interactions, to keep their clients safe and on schedule, to manage situations before they became complicated. But Eastwood wasn't asking for permission or waiting for approval. He was already moving, his focus entirely on the man against the wall, and his security team could only follow and adapt. What happened next was not a photo opportunity. There were no cameras positioned to capture a charitable moment. No publicist had arranged a heartwarming encounter for media consumption. This was simply one man approaching another, but the deliberateness of Eastwood's movement, the complete shift in his attention, signaled that something significant was occurring. As he reached the veteran, Eastwood did something that shocked his bodyguards even more than the decision to approach. He lowered himself down to the man's level. Not standing over him in a position of superiority and condescension, not bending slightly while maintaining distance, but actually getting down to meet him eye to eye, person to person, as equals. The veteran looked up, startled. You could see the moment of recognition flicker across his face, confusion, disbelief, then something else, something more vulnerable. How long had it been since someone had truly looked at him? How many thousands of people had passed by, their gazes sliding away, treating him as part of the architecture rather than as a human being. And now one of the most recognizable faces in America was sitting beside him on the cold pavement, looking directly at him, seeing him. Eastwood extended his hand. They shook, a firm grip between them, and then they began to talk. Not a brief exchange, not a quick "thank you for your service" platitude before moving on, but an actual conversation. Eastwood asked his name, asked where he'd served, asked about his service. The bodyguards watched in amazement as minutes passed, as their client sat on the ground outside a theater in his good clothes, completely absorbed in conversation with a homeless veteran, seemingly oblivious to everything else around him. The veteran's story emerged haltingly at first, then with more confidence as he realized this wasn't a performance, that Eastwood's interest was genuine. He'd served 2 tours in Vietnam, had come home to a country that didn't want to hear about what he'd experienced, had struggled with nightmares and rage, and an inability to connect with the world he'd returned to. There had been jobs, then no jobs. There had been family, then estrangement. There had been attempts to get help that became exhausting navigations of bureaucracy and wait lists. There had been a long, slow slide, from barely managing to not managing at all. And through it all, the service he'd given, the sacrifices he'd made, had seemed to matter less and less until they felt like something from another lifetime, another person's story. Eastwood listened with complete attention. Those who observed from a distance noted that he wasn't performing listening. He was actually listening, asking questions, responding to answers, creating space for this man to be heard in a way he probably hadn't been in years. The bodyguards, trained to watch for threats and manage situations, found themselves witnessing something entirely different. A moment of profound human connection happening in the most unlikely circumstances. Then Eastwood reached into his jacket. The bodyguards tensed slightly, an automatic response, but he was pulling out his wallet. He removed cash, not conspicuously, not making a show of it, but deliberately counting out bills. This wasn't a 20 slipped over quickly to assuage guilt and move on. This was substantial money, the kind of money that could mean a hotel room for weeks, could mean meals and safety and a buffer against the immediate desperation of life on the streets. He placed it in the veteran's hands, closing the man's fingers around the bills. But Eastwood wasn't finished. This is the part that truly shocked his security team, the part that revealed something about character that years of professional association hadn't fully shown them. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Right there, sitting on the pavement, he was making arrangements. He spoke to someone at a veteran services organization, someone he apparently had a relationship with, describing the situation, vouching for this veteran personally, asking what could be done immediately. He gave his name as a reference. He committed to following up personally. He made it clear that this wasn't just a momentary gesture, but the beginning of actual help. The veteran's eyes filled with tears. You could see him struggling to maintain composure, decades of hardening and survival instincts warring with the overwhelming emotion of being seen, being valued, being helped by someone with absolutely no obligation to do so. Eastwood gripped his shoulder, said something quietly that only the veteran could hear, and then slowly stood. He made sure the veteran had his personal contact information. He made sure the arrangements were clear. And only then, after ensuring that real assistance was in motion, did he finally turn toward the theater entrance. His bodyguards were speechless. They'd seen celebrities do charity events, write checks at fundraisers, pose for photos with causes. They'd never seen anything like this. This unscripted, prolonged, personal engagement with someone society had rendered invisible. There had been no calculation in it, no awareness of image management, no concern for expensive clothes on dirty pavement or schedules disrupted or the vulnerability of extended exposure in an uncontrolled environment. There had been only a recognition of service, a respect for sacrifice, and a refusal to walk past someone who'd given so much and received so little in return. As word of the encounter spread, it did so quietly at first. The veteran himself shared the story with counselors at the services organization Eastwood had connected him with. Those counselors, moved by the account, mentioned it to others in the veteran community. Slowly, through word of mouth rather than press releases, the story emerged. When it finally reached wider attention, many were skeptical. It seemed too perfectly aligned with Eastwood's public image, too conveniently heartwarming. But those who knew him weren't surprised at all. They recognized it as entirely consistent with the private man behind the public legend, someone who'd always valued authenticity over performance, substance over appearance, action over words. The encounter outside the theater ultimately led to the veteran receiving comprehensive services through the VA, assisted by the advocacy and navigation help that Eastwood's intervention had provided. He was connected with housing assistance, mental health services, and veteran support groups. The cash Eastwood had provided gave him the immediate stability to engage with these longer-term solutions rather than being consumed by day-to-day survival. His life didn't transform overnight into a Hollywood ending. Recovery from decades of struggle doesn't work that way. But he was given what had been missing: genuine help, delivered with respect, from someone who saw him as a person deserving of dignity rather than a problem to be managed or avoided. For the Bodyguards, the experience became something they'd recount with a kind of reverent amazement. They'd protected many high-profile individuals, had seen the full spectrum of how wealth and fame affect character. They'd witnessed pettiness and entitlement, had seen powerful people treat ordinary people with dismissive contempt, had observed the subtle and not-so-subtle ways that privilege corrupts perspective. But they'd also now witnessed the opposite: someone using privilege and platform not for self-aggrandizement, but for immediate, practical, personal assistance to someone in need, someone who the world had deemed invisible and inconvenient. The story resonates because it reveals something we desperately want to believe about character and fame, about whether the values performed in art can actually exist in life. Eastwood has made a career portraying characters defined by codes of honor, by loyalty to principles over convenience, by actions rather than words. His films explore what it means to do the right thing when no one's watching, to stand up when it's difficult, to recognize the humanity in others when society makes it easy to look away. And on that evening outside a small-town theater, when no cameras were rolling, when there was no script and no director calling for action, he demonstrated that these weren't just compelling themes for storytelling, but actual principles guiding his own choices. This matters beyond one veteran and one encounter because it challenges our collective excuses. How many of us have walked past someone in need, telling ourselves that we're too busy, that we don't have cash, that there are programs and services, that someone else will help, that we can't possibly make a difference with the problems being so systemic and overwhelming? How many times have we made someone invisible through our deliberate inattention, our protective discomfort, our practiced avoidance? The story of what Eastwood did doesn't let us hide behind those excuses. It demonstrates that seeing people, truly seeing them and responding to their humanity, is always possible regardless of how busy we are or how complicated the systemic issues might be. The question that haunts anyone who hears this story is simple and uncomfortable. What would I have done? Would I have noticed the veteran at all? Or would he have been part of the background, functionally invisible to my purpose-driven movement from car to destination? If I had noticed, would I have felt that twinge of sympathy that we've learned to suppress quickly, that momentary discomfort that passes as soon as we're through the door? Would I have thought about helping later, maybe donating to a veterans organization, converting the immediate confrontation with suffering into an abstracted future charitable impulse that probably never actually materializes? Or would I have done what Eastwood did, stopped, changed course, given time and attention and resources, made it personal, followed through? For the vast majority of us, if we're honest, the answer is uncomfortable. We wouldn't have done what Eastwood did, not because we're bad people, but because we've been trained by society and circumstance to manage our empathy, to protect ourselves from being overwhelmed by need, to keep moving. We've learned to see systemic problems as too big for individual response, and we've learned to make individuals disappear into those systemic abstractions. Someone sitting on the street stops being a veteran with a specific story and becomes instead a representation of veteran homelessness as an issue, something to be concerned about in general while doing nothing about in particular. What Eastwood's actions model is a different approach, treating the systemic and the individual as connected rather than separate. Yes, veteran homelessness is a massive systemic failure requiring policy changes, increased funding, better VA services, and societal transformation. But it's also 40,000 individual human beings, each with a name, each with a story, each approachable and helpable right now, today, in immediate and tangible ways. We don't have to choose between systemic advocacy and individual action. We can do both. We should do both. In the years since that evening in Carmel, Eastwood has continued his support for veteran causes, quietly and without fanfare. He's used his platform to advocate for better services and more comprehensive support. He's continued personal involvement in ways that don't make headlines, because that's never been the point. For him, this isn't about image management or legacy burnishing. It's about consistent application of values that he clearly holds deeply, expressed through actions rather than press releases. The veteran from that evening, when asked about the encounter later, struggled to find adequate words. How do you describe what it means to be invisible and then suddenly seen? How do you express what happens when someone of Eastwood's stature treats you not as a charity case or a photo opportunity, but as a fellow human being worthy of time and genuine attention? The money helped immensely in practical terms, enabling stability and access to services. But what stayed with him even more was the simple fact of being noticed, being listened to, having someone care enough to sit down on the cold pavement and share space, rather than maintaining the distance that hierarchy and circumstance would have made so easy to preserve. This is what shocked the Bodyguards, not that their client was generous, not that he cared about veterans, but that he was willing to completely set aside the protocols and protections and efficiencies that govern celebrity existence to engage in messy, complicated, time-consuming human connection with someone whose society had rendered functionally invisible. In a world increasingly mediated by screens and transactions, where even our charitable impulses get routed through apps and organizations that maintain comfortable distance between us and actual need, Eastwood's choice to go direct, to make it personal, to sit on the ground and be present, represented something almost radical in its simplicity. The story serves as a mirror, reflecting back to us both our failures and our possibilities. Every day we have opportunities to see people who've become invisible, to stop when it's inconvenient, to give time when we're busy, to recognize humanity when it's easier to look away. Most days we fail these small tests of character, and the world spins on, and we tell ourselves it doesn't matter because what can one person do? But sometimes someone shows us what one person can do when they refuse to accept invisibility as inevitable, when they treat encounter as opportunity, when they let values guide actions rather than letting convenience govern choices. Clint Eastwood didn't solve veteran homelessness that evening in Carmel. He helped one person, which in the face of systemic failure affecting 40,000 might seem insignificant. But it wasn't insignificant to that one person. And the story of what he did, spreading through the veteran community and beyond, has inspired others to stop, to see, to engage, to help. Ripples spreading outward from one act of recognition and respect, one refusal to accept invisibility, one moment when someone chose connection over convenience. His bodyguards were shocked because they saw their client reveal a depth of character that years of professional association hadn't fully shown them. They saw someone willing to set aside every protective layer that wealth and fame provide to be simply present with suffering. They saw values that had defined a career of storytelling prove to be not just compelling fiction, but actual operating principles. And they saw that the strong, silent type who lets action speak louder than words wasn't just a character Clint Eastwood played. It was who he actually was, sitting on cold pavement outside a theater, listening to a veteran's story, making sure one person who'd served his country would not be invisible anymore.